Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us today. Before I introduce Ricardo, just remind you what's up next week. The Nature Recovery Seminar next week, or the 21st, is Minda Bastida and Geraldine Encina, and they're going to be talking about the return of the mermaid, revitalizing the Lerma wetlands of the highlands of central Mexico. So yeah, come along for that. And yeah, so I just wanted to introduce Ricardo. I'm sure many of you know him. He is in the Department of Biology. He's a conservation scientist. He works in forests and island landscapes, and his aim is to understand conservation in a changing world. And today you're going to be talking about fragmented forests.
Yep. Yep, exactly.
Yeah. I think one or two people will probably still pop in, but if you want to start,
Okay.
you don't need this. No.
No, I
Okay.
think I'm good.
Thanks.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So today I'm going to be speaking mostly about bats, fragmentation, secondary forests. But this talk has two main goals. And one is to present you some evidence that secondary forests can help to mitigate the impacts of fragmentation in the tropics. And another goal of this talk that is even more important is to show you that bats are cute. So, as we all know, tropical forests harbor the bulk of the planet's biodiversity, and through ecosystem services and economic goods are important for human populations at both the local, regional, and local scale. However, landscapes such as this one that I photographed in Madagascar a couple of years ago are increasingly common. And this is well, might as well slow down. I'm going very fast through my slides. I'm coming to realize. This is a recently published map. Might as well wait. Sorry. Hey. I should have waited 1 or 2 more minutes. Well, the only thing that you lost that is of relevance is that I'm going to try to convince you that bats are cute. That's one of the main goals of this topic of this talk. So this map here shows forest cover in the last 60 years. So in green, what you have is areas that you have stable forest cover since the 60s. In red, we have areas that have been deforested. And if you pay attention, most of those areas are located in the tropics. But in blue, we actually have areas of forest gain. And much of this gain is associated with agroforestry, with forest plantations. But a fair share of this as well, it's natural regeneration. And that is what I'm going to be speaking about mostly today. So quite a lot of work has been devoted to the impacts of forest loss and forest fragmentation. And we very much know that it tends to be bad for forest biodiversity. Forest animals don't tend to do well with deforested landscapes. However, many of these areas that have been deforested don't stay deforested forever. And a fair share of those areas transition into second growth, so secondary forests. There has been substantial work in secondary forest dynamics and how ecological systems unfold in those landscapes. This is an excellent book by Robin Chazen that compiles much of the research that has been conducted in secondary forests until, well, 10 years ago. It's quite bizarre because all of this, when I first using this slide, it felt that it was very recent, but out of the blue, 10 years have passed. Okay, and gaining better understanding of ecological dynamics of secondary forests is increasingly important in this age of deforestation that we're living. So now let me take you to the Amazon. So imagine yourself on top of a 40-meter tower above the forest canopy. In the background, you can see these birds flying. You can probably hear some macaws. And you would be excused if you think that you would be surrounded by primary forest. And here, so this photo was taken in one of such towers, and here it would not be the case. So what you're seeing here is actually secondary forest. This is secondary growth at the biological dynamics of forest fragments projects. And this was a project that was started by Thomas Lovejoy that you can see here in the photo. So this is a whole ecosystem experiment in the Amazon. It started in the late 70s. And it's located close to Manaus, 100 kilometers north of Manaus. And it's big. So it's 1,000 square kilometers. Most of the area, or a fair amount of this was deforested in the late 70s to give place to cattle. But in the mid 80s, much of cattle farming was abandoned. And these areas that were deforested were allowed to regenerate into secondary forest. Still, it's really hard. So unless you have been to this sort of continuous forests lowland continuous forests in the mainland, is really hard to grasp how extensive they are. So I'm from an island, and when I look at the horizon, I see blue all the way to the horizon. Here is very much the same. You look at the horizon and you see green as far as the eye can reach. So when I'm saying that it's continuous forest, it very much feel like that. So this is the island where I'm from, Madeira. This is the size of the biological dynamics of forest fragments, more or less at the same scale. So you can see that it's big. So these areas here that are dotted are secondary forests nowadays. So previously those were the cattle farms. The areas in dark surrounded by the dots are the forest fragments. So I failed to mention here, but this ecological experiment has 11 forest fragments, has 5 forest fragments of 1 hectare, 4 of 10, and 2 of 100 hectares. Well, some are very close to the primary forest, as you see here. So the minimum distance is 80 meters, so it's quite close to primary forest. But some are very isolated, more than half a kilometer into the matrix. So nowadays, the landscape looks more or less like this. So this is a 1 hectare, 100 hectare fragment. This area here is secondary forest. This around, so every 10 years, they experimentally re-isolate the fragments. This is what you can see here. This leaf that Thomas Lovejoy is holding is a Cecropia leaf. And most of the forest here it's either dominated by Cecropia or Vismia, depending on whether the forest has been burned or not. So if you pay attention to this, so this is how it looks from the inside. So if you're in a secondary forest, if you look around, this is very much what you see. And if you're not very familiar with primary forests, secondary forests, how good of a habitat this is, it kind of looks like good habitat. So if you're familiar with secondary forests, you will see that the density of trees is quite high. So the stems are very thin. So it's secondary. It's clearly secondary forest, but it's an okayish habitat. And one big question is how much of the biodiversity that was found in this place originally can survive here, can still make use of this sort of environment. And when I speak about the sort of biodiversity that exists here, it's considerable. So all of these species I've seen when I was doing fieldwork there. So it's lowland Amazonian rainforest, one of the richest regions of the globe. So one key question is how much of this biodiversity can make use of secondary forest? Another one is how does fragment communities are influenced by the secondary forest dynamics? So here you have a 1 hectare fragment. This is the re-isolation of the fragments that takes place every 10 years. But this in the background is secondary forest. So how does this maturation of the secondary forest influence forest communities? So these 2 questions were the ones that we wanted to investigate. And we set to address these questions using these fellows as a model system. So this is Mesophila maconelli, and it's a particularly cute species. But the reason why we used bats was kind of threefold. The first one is that the Amazon, it's the global hotspot of bat diversity. So here you have the number of bat species around the globe, red showing the areas of highest bat richness. And you can pretty much see that the area where we were working is one of the richest. The other reason is that bats are really important for multiple ecosystem services. So they're key pollinators, they're seed dispersers, they have a massive role in terms of arthropod suppression. But a really important reason why we used bats was that bats had been sampled in the biological dynamics of forest fragments in the late 90s in continuous forests and forest fragments, and in the early 2000s in secondary forests. So this is very much how the landscape looked like in the late 90s. So here you can see some pasture with some early stage secondary forest in the background. This is very much how it looked in the period while we were there, so between 2011 and 2013. And our main question was, how does secondary forest regeneration impacts or buffers the impacts of forest fragments on bat assemblages? And we had 3 main questions. How has species richness and abundance changed between periods? So since the late 90s to 2011, 2013. We wanted to know if there were differences between specialist species and generalist species. So this is habitat specialist species, and here forest specialists. And what are the species level responses? So to address this, we set to revisit the sites that were sampled in the late 90s. So this were 6 sites in continuous forest here in dark green, 6 forest fragments in light green, and 7 sites in secondary forest. So we sampled these sites in 2011, 2013. In total, each site has been sampled between 11 and 20 times. We captured more than 6,000 bats of 50 species. This work, or the core section of the work that I'm going to be presenting today, is with data collected with mist nets. And with mist nets in the tropics, we mostly capture philostimids that are called the leaf-nosed bats due to that structure over there, and Mormopidae, this mustached bats. And to analyze the data, we use hierarchical joint species distribution models. So these are species-specific models that are combined in a hierarchical model, and it allows for inference at both the species level and community level. We modeled abundance and occupancy independently. And as explanatory variables, we had habitat type, survey period, the amount of secondary forest within a radius of 500 meters, and survey effort. So we accounted for phylogenetic correlation. And as trades, we included if the bats were either specialists or generalists. And we classified the different species into these 2 categories based on a different data set that we had with 10,000 captures in the same area, and using a methodology that was developed by Robbie Chasden. So how has species richness and abundance changed between both periods? So plotted here, you have the mean prediction for the number of species or the number of individuals that was captured per night in both periods. So in dark colors, we have the late 90s, and in lighter colors, we have 2011, 2013. And the arrows stand for significant differences. So that means an higher than 95% probability of the predictions of the second period being higher than the predictions of the first, higher or lower than the predictions of the first period. So when we look at species richness, what we see is that there's an increase in species richness in both continuous forest and forest fragments, but there's a decline in species richness in the secondary forests. So when we look at abundance, we see that the pattern for secondary forest is even stronger. So there's a really strong decline in the amount of individuals that was captured in secondary forests in 2011, 2013 in relation to the late 90s. So is there any difference between habitats generalists and specialists? There is. So here you can see very clearly that the patterns are distinct. So when we look at generalists, you can see that the patterns are quite similar to the ones that we found at the whole assemblage level. So we have an increase of both species richness. Well, actually here we don't have much of a change in abundance, but for species richness, we have an increase in species richness in both the continuous forest and the fragments. So the fragments, there's not much of statistical support, but you can see a bit of a pattern there. But you can see very clearly that there's a clear decline in species richness and abundance of generalist species. But then we look at the generalists, and the generalists have benefited of secondary forest regeneration. So there's an increase in continuous forest, there's an increase in the fragments, and even here in the secondary forest, you can see a pattern there of increase. And something to consider is that the generalists are rare, are uncommon almost by default. So it's really hard to capture a significant difference. But we can see a bit of a pattern there. So when we zoom at the species level, we can see contrasting responses as well. So what you have plotted here is the between period percentage change in either probability of occupancy or abundance for the different species divided in generalists and in specialists. So when we look at the specialists, sorry, forgot to mention the colors. So green, this is a traffic light system. So green means that it's a positive change, so they increase in either occupancy, probability, or abundance. And red means a decline, and the dark colors stand for significant differences. So here you can see that most species have benefited from secondary forest regeneration. So there's an increase in occupancy, in abundance. But for generalists, the pattern is quite distinct. So most species have benefited in continuous forests and in the fragments, but in secondary forests, actually, they have declined in both probability of occupancy and in abundance. So different species have different levels of evolutionary heritage. So we used a recently published, and again, this recently was recent a couple of years ago. It's not so recent now. But we used a phylogenetic tree that was published some 5 years ago to look at how phylogenetic diversity was affected by this change in the age of the secondary forest. And what you can see here are the different branches of the phylogenetic tree of bats, only with the species that we have captured in the Amazon. And the branches are color-coded according to the probability of extinction in both periods. And when you see a red dot, that means that a probability of extinction of 1. So if we look at the early stage, so 15 years ago, that again, it's not 15 years ago. This is when the secondary forest was 15 years old, not 15 years ago, sorry. So you can see that most species appear as red or reddish. So they had a high extinction probability. There's lots of red dots here, meaning an extinction probability of 1. But when we transition for the most recent period, you can actually see that the amount of red dots has quite significantly declined. So there's much fewer red dots. And if I showed you, for instance, here, Lophostoma, this genus, so these bats are omnivorous. And if you look at, it's a big bat. This bat is kind of the size of a blackbird. And if you look at that jaw there, like it can bite. So it's a omnivorous bat that eats a lot of meat. So this one is a frog eating bat. Surprise, surprise! It's eating a frog. So bats in the Amazon. So some are proper carnivorous bats. But in the first period, 3 of the 4 bats of that genus had an extinction probability of 1 in our landscape, whereas in the second period, none of those bats within the genus Lophostoma had an extinction probability of 1. So here, actually, so this stands for the different guilds of bats. So the frugivorous, the insectivorous, these ones are omnivorous. This one feeds on blood. Surprise, surprise, is the vampire bat. And we were capturing the bats. We were collecting trade data, all sorts of trade data that is publicly available. So, and we were collecting data about body mass, wing ratio, wing loading, wing ratio. What else were we collecting? We were gathering information about their diet. So we had plenty of trade data for our species. And with that, we looked at functional diversity. And this very much gives an insights of the role of the different species within the ecosystem. And we wanted to know how does functional diversity has changed between periods as well. So what we have here plotted, not going into the specifics of the metrics, but is functional diversity. And what you can see is that we don't have much of a change in continuous forest. We don't have much of a change in the forest fragments. But here, highlighted in blue, we have the change in functional diversity in secondary forests. And it's actually quite big. So there was an increase in the functional diversity of bats in secondary forests in just a 15-year period. So take homes from this. So we found landscape-wide benefits of matrix regeneration on both the taxonomic, phylogenetic, and functional diversity of bats. We found contrasting responses in generalists and specialist species. And this is especially important because the specialist species tend to be the old growth the species of the species of highest conservation concern. They're often associated with old growth forest. And taken together, this shows that secondary forests can help to mitigate some of the impacts of forest fragmentation. So what we have here is that there's a clear influence of the habitat on the bat communities. So here I have this arrow that shows this unidirectional relationship between, so habitat influences bat communities, but in reality, it does not work like this. It's much more complex, and our patterns, our results kind of give insights to that. So the relationship is actually bidirectional. So when we have the maturation of secondary forests, so when we go from this to this influences bat communities. But as bat communities change, they change their habitat as well. And what I'm going to be telling you is true for bats, but it's true for a bunch of other taxa as well. So what happens when you fragment a landscape is that in rough terms, you tend to lose the habitat specialists. So bats such as this one, this is Trachopsychosus, so the frog-eating bats. This species that are heavily associated with old growth, they tend to disappear. However, some species that can benefit of the resources that appear in a landscape, if this is a fragmented landscape, the jargon, the term would be the matrix. So the species that can benefit with the additional resources in the matrix actually increase massively in abundance. So this bat here, this is Sturnira. So the English name is yellow-shouldered bats. So these bats are heavily specialized in early successional shrubs. So here, this is meant to depict Solano, that you're probably familiar with, but it's an early stage neotropical shrub that it's very rare in a primary forest. So if you think about a primary forest, you only get this sort of shrubs when there's a big tree fall, like a tree falls and then there's an island surrounded by an ocean of forest in which there's this shrub. So they're actually quite rare. So in a primary forest, I only captured one of these bats, and I know that they're there as a population because it was a pregnant female and it was very, very pregnant. But the default of this species is that it's meant to be very rare. But in the first period that this landscape was sampled, this was the third most common bat in the secondary forest. It was very, very happy there, feeding in all the ocean of solanum that could be found in that landscape. However, as the secondary forest dynamics proceeded, the solanum give place to early successional trees, and these are mostly Vismia and Cecropia, and these bats pretty much disappeared from the landscape. And now the most common one is this one. So this is Carolia perspicillata, and this we owe greatly to this species. So this is the main seed dispersal of secondary trees in the neotropics. So this is more than 50% of our bat captures in the Amazon were this bat. And if you capture this bat and you have it in your hand for 5 minutes, chances are that you will end those 5 minutes with seeds on your palms, like they're going around. And we often refer to seed rain, and it's basically poo, or either bats or birds that are going around the landscape and planting, like dispersing seeds, and many of those seeds end up developing into trees that ends up developing into a forest. And we really need the secondary forest, because the secondary forest is the nursery from the massive trees that we associate the Amazon and other forests with. So point being that deforestation, the specialized species disappear from the landscape. You get this early successional specialized species like the previous one, then you get this one. But as the secondary forest continues to mature, you get these fellows back. So you get the old growth species, the specialist bats back. And these specialist bats, they do this. So they go after the arthropods. So the arthropods, a fair share of those are insectivorous. Insectivorous, they're herbivorous. So they're, I don't know to what level, suppressing the plant communities, I can imagine. So we really lack data for this. But there's a really cool paper from 2008 from Elizabeth Kalko that she actually quantified the impact of herbivory the impact of bat predation on herbivorous insects and on plant damage in Panama, and there's some evidence showing that this fellows here, and potentially Owen and others will know this better than me, they must have an impact on forest dynamics, and the bats, by preying on the herbivorous insects, might be helping to accelerate the secondary forest succession. So, and point being about all of this is that the relationship is bidirectional. So you have the bat communities being influenced by the habitat, but the bats then kind of contributing for for the habitat in multiple different ways. So let me contrast the findings of my study with this study here. So this was a paper that was published in Science in 2013 by Gibson et al. And it's very similar to what we did. So this was a study in Thailand. It's a temporal comparison. So they sampled rodents. And when this paper came out, it was picked up by the media. And this is an article from BBC that you can see the title, Forest Fragmentation Triggers an Ecological Armageddon. So what they showed is that in a period of 30 years, rodent communities went from this huge value here to zero. So there was a big decline in the number of species that were present in the forest fragments. This paper made to Science, quite a big thing. So now if we contrast the results, so they were sampling rodents, we were sampling bats. They had a 20-year comparison, we have a 15-year comparison, but the big difference, other than rodents are not very good flyers, is that they had a hard matrix, whereas we had a soft matrix. So their matrix is static, is water, where ours is dynamic. So it's a secondary forest that matures in time and gets closer in terms of habitat complexity and the resources that it has to primary forest. And whereas they have this Armageddon story to tell, this very cataclysmic, this complete collapse of rodent communities, that actually it's not due to fragmentation. In that paper, when you read like the final paragraph, is due to an invasive rodent. We actually have an optimistic story to tell. So basically, our results show that if we give nature a chance, nature can bounce back. And we need to bear in mind that this is the biological dynamics of forest fragments. So it's an experimental manipulation, is a very artificial setting. So it's surrounding by continuous forests. So there's a big source pool of animals that can easily recolonize the areas that have been affected. There's no additional human use, there's no forest fires. So it's very buffered from many of the anthropogenic stressors that we have in real world landscapes, but nonetheless, it's a positive story. So it would be very reasonable for you to ask, how fragmented is a landscape that is like this, that is surrounded by secondary forest? And we asked the exact same question. So we contrasted our results, so our data, with data collected by my PhD supervisor in Panama. And so here, this is Bajo, Colorado. So this is a land bridge system in the Panama Canal with multiple islands of different sizes. And my PhD supervisor sampled, well, my PhD supervisor is Christoph Meyer. So Christoph was sampling a bunch of fragments there in the late 90s. Let me see if this is correct. No, actually, it's early 2000s. Sorry, it's early 2000s. And we did something very similar in the Amazon, and we contrasted basically species richness in our fragments with the fragments surrounded by water. And here you have that. So here you have species richness, here you have forest patch area. And if you look at the relationship, it's actually quite similar. So our fragmented landscape is very fragmented. And what I showed you in terms of the data, the temporal comparison of the data from the late 90s and 2011, 2013 is a really small subset of the data that we collected and of the places that we sampled. Actually, what we did for the whole study was we sampled 44 sites throughout the landscape. Each site was visited 8 times, and the sites were in continuous forests, secondary forests, and forest fragments. And then for both continuous forests and forest fragments, we sampled the interior, the edge, and the matrix. And what you can see here is data only for the second period. So here you can see frugivorous bats, and most generalist species are frugivorous bats. And here are the gleaners. Gleaners are the ones that pick their prey, such as this bat is doing here. So this tend to be the specialist bats. And what you have here in gray is continuous forest. These are the fragments in white. The asterisks here relate to significant differences in relation to continuous forest, to the interior of continuous forest. And you can see that the patterns are very different. So if you go to continuous forest interiors and you contrast the capture rate of gleaners, it's much, much greater that we would find in the other habitats. Well, and especially much greater that you would find in fragments. So it's the landscape, even to the eyes of a bat that can fly, it's still very, very fragmented. And then we went further and we asked, okay, so can we find trades-related responses? So are there particular trades that are associated with fragmentation? And we did find quite a lot of trades that are heavily associated with the vulnerability of different species to fragmentation. Then we asked, and this is only a subset, we asked if these responses to bats change between seasons. So do bats use this fragmented landscape in differential ways in the dry season in relation to the wet season? And they do. And we asked, do females and males use the landscape in different ways? And surprise, surprise, they do as well. So females, especially for frugivorous bats, they need lots of resources when they have their babies, when they're lactating. And the secondary forest is full of frugivorous plants. So for many species, it's actually quite handy to use that pool of resources in that particular time of the year when they have higher energetic demands. And what I've showed you until now was with MistNet data, where we're also using bioacoustics. And this is just a glimpse of the results that we had. So here in dark green, you have continuous forest, light green forest fragments, and so on. But this shows percentage occurrence of multiple species that we had there in the landscape. And you can clearly see that some species are heavily associated with continuous forest. So they're quite sensitive to forest fragmentation and deforestation, whereas other species, they really like secondary forest, so they can benefit from the additional resources that can be found there. Something else that we did was to look into edge effects. So we did this 2-kilometer transects in which at every 15 meters, we had a bat detector in the understory and another one in the canopy. And we did this for 1 kilometer into the secondary forest and 1 kilometer into the primary forest. And we looked at edge responses. So are species reacting to habitat edges? And even in this landscape, you can see that they clearly are. So here you have bat activity, and here you have distance from forest edge being 0. This is the edge between primary and secondary forest. And you can see a very clear relationship here. And this is to change gears a bit. So now I'm going to be speaking about something quite distinct. And what I'm going to be speaking about is time. So as ecologists, we tend to explore spatial patterns, spatial dynamics quite often. So it's quite, most of what I've showed you is exactly that. We're comparing habitat X with habitat Y, but it's actually really rare to dive into the temporal dimension. So you might know of this project. This is called the Biotime database, compiled by Dornelas et al. So actually, this one came out in 2018. There's an update that is just, well, it's in revision right now. But when this was released, so there was more, well, almost 9 million records of different species. And these are records from assemblages, communities that have been sampled for more than 2 years. And when you look at where this research is taking place, or more importantly, where you look at where this research is not taking place, you can see here for the tropics, we have very little. We know very little about temporal dynamic and tropical landscapes. This is our data set from the Amazon. So red stands for mammals. So this orange are plants. This is a fish. This is freshwater invertebrates. When it comes to vertebrates in the tropics, temporal dynamics, yeah, we know very, very little. And we know especially very little in humanized landscapes, like heavily humanized landscapes. And here, it's especially important because crops change. An area that was, like when I was a kid, my house was surrounded by banana plantations. And all of that nowadays is apartments. Like things have changed a lot in my lifetime. So this sort of landscapes, we know very little. So this photo was taken when I was doing fieldwork in Madagascar, 2015. It's this project now, and actually this is what I'm doing this summer as well. So I'm revisiting all of these sites here. So we sampled 55 sites throughout the landscapes, different habitats, including secondary forest. And so I'm revisiting all of these sites to try to look into temporal dynamics in this sort of landscape. And this is especially important for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is bats are key suppressors of arthropod pests. So they're very meaningful for people's livelihoods. And they also consume malaria mosquitoes here, and we have the data for that. But it's really important to understand what happens in terms of dynamics in this sort of landscapes. So right now, my plan for the next months, years, all going well. So this summer, I'm revisiting Madagascar. This is a 10-year comparison in humanized landscapes. My PhD student is just about to go to Panama. She will be doing a 20-year resampling of bats in this landscape. All going well. And if I do get the money, I'm going back to the Amazon to resample that system. So if you do have, like, yeah, a spare 1,000 that you're not doing anything with, I would welcome that. And it's really important to dive into this temporal dynamic for multiple reasons. But one of the reasons it's cultural. Like we process time, like we are storytellers, and part of storytelling is the transition of knowledge from time A to time B, and it's this intergenerational transition of knowledge. And this is what we've been doing for ever since we interacted, I imagine. But here you have the next generation, here you have another generation. This photo was taken by my good friend, John de la Maya, and it was used as a cover for conservation letters. For the type of communication that we have as scientists, we tend to go to conferences or gatherings such as this one, and we speak with each other, we publish papers, and the knowledge goes from one person to the other. But it's quite abstract when you think about it. Like there's a filter there in the process. Only a subsection of the knowledge that we have gets published. So one of the main take-home messages that I would like you to take from this is that we really need more interaction between different generations of ecologists or of biologists. And of course, like we need to interact with locals and get local knowledge, indigenous knowledge and whatnot. But even when we think only about the scientists, there's a lot to be said about intergenerational knowledge exchange. And not only by reading papers, like this person here, this is Thomas Lovejoy. And this photo was taken, this camp here is a very famous camp in tropical ecology. It's called Kilometer 41. So Thomas Lovejoy has taken Tom Cruise to this in the 90s. So it's a big thing in tropical ecology. There's a harpy eagle nest in a tree just here. But this is Thomas Lovejoy in kilometer 41. This is me, just back there, like 200 meters inside the forest. The thing is that I never interacted with Thomas Lovejoy. So Thomas Lovejoy unfortunately passed a couple of years ago, some 2 to 3 years ago. And shamefully, so we have been in the fields at the same time, but we never interacted. So all the things that I've learned about the system in the 2010, 2011, like I was not able to tell him, and he was never able to tell me what he'd learned from the onset of on the project. So my point is that we really need more interaction between different generations of ecologists, and we need to be on the ground with the people, and they need to tell us what they have done, so that if we want to do it, we do it in the exact same way so that we can compare. Okay, so that was all that I had to share with you today. Thank you very much. If you want to learn more about bats in the Amazon, this book is stems from the fieldwork that we've conducted. So this is a field guide to the bats of the Amazon. It's freely available online, so you can just download it, and we have the rights for it. So sorry, Pelagic, but yeah, you can download it, but you should buy it. So as you can imagine, this is the work of loads of different people. Only a subset of the people that were involved in this work are represented here. And yeah, now this is it. This is all that I had to share. Thank you.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
I'm opening the ground floor to questions, but if you are going to ask a question, just let me give you the speaker, because it's for the people online. So here we go.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
Two related questions. One is that the generalist bats seems to decrease in the secondary forest, right? What is it there they don't like or doesn't suit them? That's one. And the second one is if you have any idea or if you are measuring any aspects of the plants as habitats for the bats, or if there's anything in the architecture that could help you predict what bats are going to find it better or worse, beyond the fact that they eat fruits, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for both questions. So starting with the first one, well, there's a phrase that I really like in ecology, that it's in nature is common to be rare and it's rare to be common. So abundance, like the general average abundance of a species in a forest, is actually quite low. Like it's really, really rare to have overly abundant species. But then when we modify the landscapes, oftentimes we provide additional resources for a subset of species, and those become overly abundant. So in the first period, we were exactly at that stage that some species have benefited from this overabundance of early successional fruits, and their abundance was inflated. So the thing is that, again, like we struggle with time. Like we take, it's a thing about shifting baselines. We take what we see as our baseline, but that baseline was not the baseline that it should be. Like that, the abundance of those habitat generalists was inflated by this additional resources. The abundance of those resources declined with secondary succession, and they just levered down to more normal abundance patterns. That's how I digest that. For the structure of the forest, so for all of the sites, we had 6 plots that we measured all sorts of different characteristics. So stem density, the diameter at breast height, canopy cover, like stratification of the vegetation at different heights and so on. And we use that in our analysis. So that paper that is trade-related responses, we use the different or a subset of the different vegetation metrics that we collected, and we can clearly see that carnivore bats like areas where there's a higher density of big trees, for instance. So you can really see it's a PCA, so you can see the axis going in the same direction. So we looked into that, and it's of course like it's things like
Why they prefer the big trees?
so multiple things. It can be from additional roosts. It can be from additional prey. So if we go in the other direction where we have more frugivorous bats, so one of the things that we were counting was the density of Vismia and Cecropia trees. And where we had more Vismia and Cecropia trees, we had more Carolia and this other species, other types of frugivorous bats. So that relationship is very clear. They're going after the fruit. But yeah, it's very obvious in the data.
Before anyone puts their hand up, I just wanted to ask a question. You looked at the temporal trends of the bats, and I was seeing in the continuous forest, you also get an abundance increase. Have you just got better at sampling bats over time, or why?
So yeah, I don't know. That was a really curious pattern. The thing is that even it comes to our baseline. And even the baseline, even the communities in the baseline change, and that might be natural fluctuations. It might be that there might be some spillover from the wider landscape into the areas that we were sampling in the continuous forest, because we call continuous forest, but some bats here, especially the insectivorous ones, they can fly 100 kilometers in a night. So for me, getting 2 kilometers into the forest, and I call it inside forest, continuous forest interior, for the bat is still the edge. So there might be some influence there, but we have another paper that we call before and after control impact and assessment of something. And basically we looked at how the re-isolation of the forest fragments influenced the communities. And we sampled both before and after the re-isolation in both the fragments, but also in continuous forest. And in just 2 years, we could see a difference in the continuous forest. And that, I was the one doing that. And I don't think that it was methodological. I just think that there's some degrees of natural variation that just get captured in the data.
I saw somebody around here had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ricardo. Great talk. I agree, bats are cute.
Thank you.
So, yeah, somewhat related to your answer to the previous question, in the Amazon, your habitats are in quite close proximity and the bats are reasonably mobile, so there'll be an element of spillover. So I'm wondering to what extent the community differences you see between these habitats reflecting kind of foraging preferences. And is it possible that some of the bats that are doing well in apparently doing well in secondary forests are actually dependent on resources in nearby primary forests for roosting or breeding, etc.?
I think that's the case, and that's especially the case for the habitat specialists. The increase that we see in both abundance and occupancy. And I don't know if I was careful, but I tried to be careful when I was saying that we wanted to see how bats persist, or at least make use of secondary forest, because what we were capturing potentially was just was making use. So he goes there for a snack and then he goes back to sleep in his quarters. So I think that was happening, and I haven't looked, so we were marking the bats with both. Anyway, the carnivore bats, we were putting P tags, so microchips and whatnot, and we have the movement data. And I could see, just looking at the data, that there was a bit of that. So this carnivorous bats and omnivorous bats, that I was capturing them in both the secondary forest and the primary forest. But I haven't looked into that. And then we have very few captures. There's not much that I can read that data, but there was certainly bats moving between both habitats.
So very cool. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and related to Sandra's question, you kind of answered this a little bit, but in thinking about conservation and the effects of fragmentation and rare species and common species, did you find when it was fragmented that you lost more rare species and then they came back in the secondary forest, or were there any patterns that having to do with gain or loss of rare species compared to common ones?
So yeah, the first ones to go were the rarest ones, like the top carnivore bats.
When the forest became more fragmented.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. And that pattern again. So actually, there's some early papers that are really interested that they speak about the overcrowd effect. So when you fragment the landscape, actually in the beginning, you have a boost in abundance and richness in the fragments, because everything in the surrounding becomes non-habitat potentially, or at least less suitable habitat. So the individuals congregate.
Well, like Barro, Colorado, for example, when
Yeah,
okay.
that's another example. The Kiribati River in Borneo, right? That strip of forest there that you go and you see loads of animals, and you see loads of animals because they have nowhere where else to go. So you have this overcrowd effect. But then after that, you start losing the more resilient ones. So the ones that can disperse over the matrix and go elsewhere do that. Many of the other ones that they don't have enough resources, they die out. And of course, there's lags. So if we're thinking about, there's lags. If we're thinking extinction depths associated with the life history. So if we're looking at plants, there's some plants there that potentially are still there in a fragment that is surrounded by non-habitat for quite a long time. But then when they die, like, there's no regeneration of those populations.
I just wanted to take a question from online. It's from Ruth Shaw, and she said, it's a great talk, but I missed what was meant by occupancy. And the second question was from a more biogeographic perspective, is can you see similar dynamics in the fossil record? Take that to know.
Okay, I'm gonna start with the first one. Occupancy is just jargon for presence absence. So it's just, did we capture the bat or not? Presence absence. It's just jargon. And the second one, the fossil record. What can I say about this? I actually don't know. The only thing that I can say about the fossil record of bats. So bats are cute, but they're also very, very cool. One of the things that it's cool about bats is that they have a cool fossil record that it's very bizarre. So it's very cool because it's the old specimens that are very old, like 50 to 16 million years, are really well conserved, and you can extract a lot of information. But there's a big gap in between that we don't know much. So we don't know much, but what we know really well because they're very conserved there. And there's why do I know this? Because there's a TEDx talk that speaks about this, and it's one of the best TEDx talks that I've seen. It speaks about what came first, echolocation or flight, and there's 3 theories and whatnot, and it's amazing. And I incentivize everybody to listen to that, but I don't know how to reply to the.
That was excellent, Ricardo, and very encouraging, I think, for reforestation and how animals coming back into secondary forest. But given that you're from an island and you're going to work also in Madagascar, what's your expectation for that this kind of dynamic ever being relevant even, you know, in island systems, given that the matrix is so highly modified. The matrix itself is so highly modified. So what do you, I mean, what's your feeling for what should happen in secondary forest in those kinds of environments? Kind of like what you said was going on in Thailand.
Thank you so much for that question, Rosie. I think that it's a really important one, and I'm going to reply to it in a different way. Basically, I'm going to zoom out. So when you think about this, so there's a book by, what's her name? Elizabeth Clare? No. Anyway, it's called The Sixth Extinction, and the book won a Pulitzer. And there's a chapter there that it's called Islands Inland, and those islands inland are these islands that I told you. So there's a line there that they say, it's noon and there's a Portuguese bat researcher that just finished preparing pasta. So that's me. But basically, it presents these fragments that I told you as islands. So they were islands surrounded previously by cattle and nowadays by secondary forest, but islands nonetheless. When we think about islands surrounded by water, like oceanic islands in a more traditional sense, and now only sticking with oceanic islands. So they're surrounded by ocean as well, but some of the dynamics that we saw here of extinction, recolonization, and so on happen in islands as well. So the thing is that the matrix here is not great, like it's not bad, but it's not great. The matrix, when you think about an island such as mine, Madeira, the matrix is terrible. Like it's salt water, and there's a lot of it. Like there's a lot of water. So if a species that was common there in the island becomes extinct, it's gone, and chances for that species to recolonize are actually quite minute. So when we're speaking about common species, like we have what we have here, blackbirds. So here there's plenty of blackbirds, and we have blackbirds back home in Madeira. But if they get extinct in Madeira, it might take a couple of million years for them to recolonize. Like it's not like here that you have your cats going out and your cats bring some blackbirds disappear, and yeah, they will come back. If it's an oceanic island, chances of the birds coming back are actually quite minute. But addressing the same dynamics of secondary succession in islands, we're having the exact same. So in Madeira, many of the islands that were used for agriculture in the past are not used nowadays. So if you go there, you see it very, very clearly. And it's early successional dynamics. So you see the early successional shrubs occupying many of the agricultural areas. And all going well, those might develop into forest. So, and I guess that in my case, in Madeira, we're going into that direction. Other places are going still in the other direction, that they're going from primary to deforestation, but the same sort of dynamics of regeneration and potential recolonization by some species might be happening. But the sad thing is that the island level, the extinction rates, both in terms of species, but also species that are not endemic from islands. So when we tend to speak about extinctions, we tend to forget about local extinctions of widespread species, and those are particularly relevant in island systems. And the recolonization of those, chances of that happen is very small. But then there's a lot to be said about active reintroductions and whatnot. Thank you.
That was a really good talk. Can you explain more? You had a phylogenetic tree with dots and the extinction probability was 1. What does that mean? Does that mean those species are definitely going extinct?
No, no, actually, I should have read that paper. So again, so that paper relates with a really good idea that I had, and I passed to someone else that did the analysis much better than I would be able to do. So the extinction probability is basically extinction at the local level, not total extinction within the landscape. But if you would sample that particular place, what are the chances of you getting this species? It's basically 0. So that would mean that it was extinct in the landscape. But yeah, the technicalities of it. That's why I had the photo of my colleague Fabio Farneda there, that he should be queried about that.
Any more last questions?
Thanks for the incredible talk. And I was very curious. I think you touched some amazing points, but about the cultural bit and the timescales, because I think culture tends to evolve with very different timescales. Like indigenous knowledge, of course, has its own timescales, like external knowledge, a different one, and species have this variability. How do you think these time cycles like sync? Is there something that we're missing culturally because, I don't know, species like tend to vary with a much shorter time scale that people can keep up? Or like, what does really stick on a long time?
So I'm gonna try to reply to this, and do let me know if I'm going in a slightly different direction. So there's some really interesting research about shifting baselines in how we perceive the landscapes and the animals within the landscapes. And for some things, we are really fast. So there's an amazing paper by Samuel Turvey, this team from ZSL, in which they looked at shifting baselines in China in relation to the Yangtze River dolphin, this other species of dolphin that they have there, this giant fish that I forgot the name. I think it's a sturgeon or something. It's big fish. So the Baji, the Yangtze River dolphin, extinct, gone. Potentially, hopefully not, but very likely it's gone. And the other two are still around, but very rare nowadays. So they went to that landscape and they surveyed the communities. And for them, they never existed. Like they were fairy tales. Like they disappeared very quickly from the common landscape. I did a paper on bats that I was just speaking about recently. So in Madagascar, it's human wildlife relationships. So in Madagascar, you have the frugivorous bats that are quite big, and you have the insectivorous bats that are quite small. The frugivorous bats, they're heavily hunted, and they completely disappeared. So the landscape where I work, I know that they're there because my colleagues have seen, and people that I've interacted with have seen them. I have never seen them in that landscape. So we surveyed more than 100 people, and we asked about the big bats and the small bats, the fanihi and well, I'm not going to say the names so that I don't embarrass myself, but they have specific names. And we asked people that are until 30 years, between 30 and 60, and more than 60. And more than 60% of the people that were more than 60-year-old know about the big bats, whereas less than 20% of the people that are younger than 30 know about the small bats. And that the transition is very quick, and it would die on a generation, I imagine, like the next one, if they're gone. So, and the other one is the reverse. So there's many species that they're so charismatic, so embedded within the culture that they disappear from the landscape, but they're still part of our common narrative. So I think that, yeah, it goes in two different paces, and it's very case specific and whatnot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Any last burning questions? Okay, well, please enjoy some drinks, and you can chat to Ricardo
Thank
after
you.
some drinks. But thank you so much. That was a really fantastic talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.